In the summer of 1985, a police helicopter lifted off from downtown Detroit, carrying what appeared to be 3 officers responding to a routine patrol call. 8 minutes later, that same aircraft vanished from radar, taking with it $3.6 million in seized drug money and leaving behind one of the most audacious law enforcement betrayals in American history. No distress signal, no emergency landing, no trace. For 23 years, the case remained Detroit's most humiliating unsolved crime. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning in 2008, a structural collapse in suburban Michigan cracked open more than just concrete and wood. It cracked open the truth. The man at the center of it all was Detective Chris Edwards, a 12-year veteran of the Detroit Police Department with an impeccable record and the trust of his superiors. Edwards had built his reputation on discipline, precision, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. His colleagues described him as methodical, reliable, and utterly predictable. He was the last person anyone would suspect of orchestrating what federal investigators would later call one of the most sophisticated inside jobs in police history. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. On the morning of July 18, 1985, Edwards reported for his shift at the Narcotics Division just like any other day. The department had recently concluded a massive drug bust that netted over $4 million in cash, weapons, and narcotics. The money was being held in the evidence vault, awaiting federal transfer to a secure facility in Washington. It was supposed to be routine, procedural, and completely secure. Edwards knew the protocols better than anyone. He had helped write them. What no one realized was that Edwards had been planning his exit for over 8 months. The meticulous detective who had earned commendations for his thoroughness had turned those same skills toward a different objective. He studied shift rotations, memorized security protocols, and identified the precise window of opportunity that would allow him to disappear without a trace. The drug money wasn't his original target. It was simply the catalyst that transformed a carefully considered plan into an irresistible opportunity. The operation required more than just inside knowledge. Edwards had cultivated relationships with 2 other individuals who would prove essential to his scheme. Marcus Thompson, a civilian helicopter pilot who had previously worked contract flights for the police department, and Denise Washington, a records clerk with access to evidence logs and transfer schedules. Neither knew the full scope of what Edwards had planned, but both were promised substantial payouts for their cooperation. Thompson believed he was helping with an off-books investigation that required discretionary transport. Washington thought she was assisting with a legitimate but sensitive evidence transfer that needed to be kept quiet for operational security. Edwards had compartmentalized the plan so effectively that neither accomplice understood they were participating in a theft. This deliberate misdirection would prove crucial when investigators later tried to piece together the conspiracy. The morning of the heist, Edwards arrived at headquarters early, as was his habit. He reviewed the evidence transfer manifest and confirmed that the $3.6 million would be moved to a federal facility that afternoon. The timing was perfect. A legitimate police helicopter was scheduled for routine maintenance, creating a gap in the flight schedule that Edwards could exploit. He contacted Thompson under the pretext of needing immediate air support for a surveillance operation in the outer suburbs. At 10:47 a.m., Edwards entered the evidence vault using his authorized access credentials. Security footage later recovered by investigators showed him moving with calm efficiency, selecting specific bags of currency while leaving others untouched. He knew exactly which containers held the highest denominations and avoided anything that would require counting or verification. The entire selection process took less than 4 minutes. Edwards loaded the bags onto a standard evidence cart and wheeled them through the building's corridors without raising suspicion. To anyone who saw him, He appeared to be conducting routine evidence management. His badge, his demeanor, and his established reputation provided perfect cover. No one questioned a veteran detective moving evidence containers during regular business hours. The helicopter was waiting at a designated landing zone, 6 blocks from police headquarters. Thompson had filed a flight plan indicating a routine patrol sweep of industrial areas on the city's outskirts. The aircraft was properly registered. The pilot was licensed, and the mission appeared legitimate on all official records. Edwards loaded the money bags into the aircraft's cargo compartment, secured his equipment, and gave Thompson the coordinates for their first waypoint. What happened next was a masterclass in misdirection and timing. The helicopter followed its filed flight plan for the first 12 minutes, maintaining radio contact with air traffic control and adhering to all standard procedures. Edwards even transmitted routine status updates to dispatch, reporting normal patrol observations and maintaining his cover as a working police officer conducting legitimate duties. But as the aircraft crossed into rural airspace northwest of Detroit, something changed. The helicopter's transponder signal began to weaken, initially appearing to be a technical malfunction rather than deliberate interference. Edwards had studied the region's radar coverage extensively and knew exactly where the blind spots existed. At 11:03 a.m., the aircraft entered a zone where multiple radar installations overlapped poorly, creating a gap in surveillance coverage. Thompson, following Edwards' precise navigation instructions, dropped the helicopter to an altitude below effective radar detection. They flew low over farmland and forest, following terrain features that provided natural concealment from ground observation. Edwards had mapped this route over months of careful reconnaissance, identifying landing sites, fuel caches, and escape routes with the same methodical approach he had once applied to police investigations. The helicopter touched down in a remote clearing approximately 80 miles northwest of Detroit. Edwards had prepared this location months in advance, clearing brush, leveling the ground, and stockpiling supplies. A modified pickup truck was hidden beneath camouflage netting, loaded with additional fuel, civilian clothing, and forged identification documents. The money was transferred from the aircraft to the vehicle in less than 10 minutes. Thompson remained with the helicopter, believing that Edwards would return shortly to continue their supposed surveillance mission. Edwards told him to wait for a radio signal that would never come. Instead, Edwards changed into civilian clothes, loaded the money into the truck, and drove deeper into the Michigan wilderness. By the time Thompson realized he had been abandoned, Edwards was already implementing the next phase of his escape plan. The helicopter pilot faced an impossible situation. He was stranded in a remote location with a police aircraft and no explanation for Edwards' disappearance that wouldn't implicate him in something far more serious than he had bargained for. Thompson made the decision that would haunt him for decades. Rather than report the situation immediately, he attempted to fly the helicopter back to Detroit, hoping to minimize his own exposure and avoid criminal charges. But Edwards had anticipated this possibility. The helicopter's fuel had been carefully calculated to run out before Thompson could reach any major airport or police facility. The aircraft went down in a wooded area 40 miles south of the original landing site. Thompson survived the crash but was severely injured and unable to communicate coherently for several days. By the time he recovered enough to tell his story, Edwards had vanished completely. The discovery of the crashed helicopter triggered a massive investigation that would consume thousands of hours and millions of dollars. Federal agents, state police, and multiple local agencies coordinated the largest manhunt in Michigan history. They found the wreckage, they found Thompson's confused testimony, and they found evidence of the carefully planned deception. But they never found Chris Edwards or the missing $3.6 million. Denise Washington became the third piece of a puzzle that investigators couldn't solve. When questioned about her role in accessing evidence logs on the morning of the theft, she broke down completely. She insisted that Edwards had told her he was coordinating with federal authorities on a sensitive transfer that required discretionary handling. Her computer access records showed she had pulled up the exact files Edwards needed, but her story remained consistent through multiple interrogations. She genuinely believed she was helping with legitimate police work. Washington's cooperation led investigators to a disturbing realization about Edwards' psychological manipulation. He had spent months building trust with both accomplices, presenting himself as a dedicated officer working on classified operations. Thompson received what appeared to be official documentation authorizing the helicopter transport. Washington was shown fabricated federal memos requesting her assistance with evidence management. Edwards had created an entire fictional operation, complete with forged paperwork and fake authorization codes. The investigation revealed the depth of Edwards' preparation in other ways. Bank records showed he had been liquidating assets for nearly a year before the heist. His modest savings account had been emptied, his car had been sold, and his apartment lease had been quietly terminated. Yet none of this activity raised red flags because Edwards had spread these transactions across multiple institutions and time periods. He had been methodically erasing his financial footprint while maintaining the appearance of a stable, committed police officer. More troubling was what investigators found at Edwards' apartment after obtaining search warrants. The space was eerily clean, almost sterile. Personal belongings were gone, photographs removed, and even the refrigerator had been emptied. But hidden behind a false wall in the bedroom closet, agents discovered a sophisticated planning archive. Maps of Michigan marked with flight paths, detailed police procedure manuals with handwritten notes, and surveillance photographs of the evidence vault taken from multiple angles over several months. The materials painted a picture of obsessive planning that went far beyond opportunistic theft. Edwards had been studying every aspect of the operation, from helicopter fuel consumption rates to federal money transfer protocols. He had documented security shift changes, noted which officers were most likely to ask questions, and even tracked weather patterns to identify optimal flying conditions. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was the product of careful, methodical intelligence applied to criminal purposes. Federal agents brought in psychological profilers to analyze Edwards' behavior patterns. They concluded that his apparent dedication to police work had actually been a form of research. Every arrest he made, every case he worked, every protocol he followed had been feeding into his understanding of law enforcement vulnerabilities. His exemplary record wasn't evidence of loyalty to the badge. It was evidence of a man systematically learning how to defeat the system from within. The search for Edwards expanded far beyond Michigan. Financial investigators tracked currency serial numbers that had been recorded during the original drug bust. They monitored banks across multiple states, watching for large cash deposits or suspicious transactions. Aircraft registries were reviewed for any unusual purchases or modifications. Border checkpoints received alerts, and international law enforcement agencies were notified. Edwards had simply vanished into thin air, taking with him the kind of money that could fund a new identity anywhere in the world. As months turned to years, the Edwards case became a cautionary tale within law enforcement circles. Police departments across the country revised their evidence handling procedures, implemented additional oversight mechanisms, and began conducting more thorough background investigations of veteran officers. The Detroit Police Department underwent a complete restructuring of its narcotics division, with new protocols designed to prevent any single individual from having the access and knowledge that Edwards had possessed. But the most haunting aspect of the case wasn't the money or the betrayal. It was the realization that Edwards had been planning his escape while continuing to work cases, testify in court, and interact with colleagues who trusted him completely. Detectives who had worked alongside him for years began questioning their memories, wondering if they had missed signs of his deception. The psychological impact on the department was devastating, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and doubt that persisted long after the investigation officially went cold. Thompson eventually recovered from his injuries and provided detailed testimony about the morning of the theft. His account corroborated the timeline investigators had reconstructed, but it also revealed the extent of Edwards' manipulation. Thompson genuinely believed he was participating in a legitimate police operation until the moment Edwards abandoned him in the wilderness. The pilot's cooperation earned him a reduced sentence, but his career in aviation was over. He spent the remaining years of his life haunted by his role in one of the most notorious police corruption cases in American history. Washington faced similar consequences despite her unwitting participation. Her security clearance was revoked, her position with the police department terminated, and her reputation permanently damaged. She struggled to find employment in law enforcement or any field requiring security clearances. The woman who thought she was helping with legitimate police work became another casualty of Edwards' carefully orchestrated deception. The crashed helicopter was eventually recovered and subjected to exhaustive forensic analysis. Investigators found evidence that Edwards had sabotaged the fuel system, ensuring that Thompson couldn't return to Detroit even if he wanted to. The modification was subtle but effective, requiring knowledge of aircraft mechanics that Edwards had apparently acquired during his months of preparation. Every detail of his plan had been considered, every contingency anticipated. Years passed without a trace of Edwards or the missing money. The case file grew thicker with false leads, mistaken identities, and alleged sightings that led nowhere. Some investigators theorized that Edwards had fled the country immediately, using forged documents to establish a new identity in a non-extradition territory. Others believed he had gone underground domestically, living quietly on the stolen funds while avoiding any activity that might attract attention. The truth was that Edwards had done something far more audacious than anyone imagined. Rather than fleeing to some distant country or hiding in remote wilderness, he had settled into a new life less than 200 miles from Detroit. Using carefully crafted false documents and a completely fabricated personal history, he had established himself in a small Michigan community where no one thought to look for a fugitive cop. For over 2 decades, he lived as a model citizen, never knowing that a structural collapse would eventually expose the secret he had buried so carefully. The small town of Millbrook, Michigan, population 3,847, was exactly the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Or so they thought. When David Reynolds moved there in late 1985, he brought with him a quiet demeanor, a modest savings account, and a story about being a recently divorced insurance adjuster from Ohio looking for a fresh start. His neighbors found him polite but private, the kind of man who kept his lawn perfectly trimmed and always returned borrowed tools in better condition than he'd received them. Reynolds rented a small house on Maple Street, nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom ranch with a detached garage and enough space for a man who claimed to value simplicity. He paid his rent in cash, which wasn't unusual for someone who said he'd been burned by banks during a messy divorce. The landlord, Mrs. Patterson, appreciated having a tenant who never complained, never caused problems, and always paid 3 months in advance. What made David Reynolds particularly unremarkable was how thoroughly ordinary he appeared to be. He shopped at the local grocery store, attended the Methodist church sporadically, and even volunteered for the annual town cleanup drives. He drove a used Ford pickup truck, wore clothes purchased from department store sales, and lived within what appeared to be the modest means of a middle-aged man starting over. No one questioned his background because there was nothing about his lifestyle that suggested deception. But David Reynolds was Chris Edwards, and every aspect of his new identity had been as carefully constructed as his original escape plan. The insurance adjuster background wasn't chosen randomly. It was a profession that required travel, explained periods of absence, and provided a plausible reason for having technical knowledge about investigations and documentation. Edwards had studied the field extensively, learning enough industry terminology and procedure to maintain the fiction during casual conversations. The house on Maple Street served a purpose beyond simple shelter. Edwards had selected it specifically for its detached garage, which provided privacy for activities his neighbors couldn't observe. The structure was solid, built in the 1960s with a concrete foundation and steel beam construction that could support significant weight. Over the years, Edwards had quietly modified the interior, creating a hidden space beneath the floor that would have impressed even his former colleagues in the Detroit Police Department. The underground chamber was a masterpiece of concealment. Edwards had excavated the space himself during his first winter in Millbrook, working only during snowstorms when the sound would be masked by wind and the frozen ground would muffle any noise. The entrance was hidden beneath a false floor section that appeared to be original construction. Even a careful inspection wouldn't reveal the modification unless someone knew exactly what to look for and had reason to be suspicious. Inside this hidden vault, Edwards stored more than just money. The space contained multiple sets of identification documents, each corresponding to different potential identities he could assume if David Reynolds ever became compromised. There were birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses, and even college transcripts, all professionally forged and aged to appear authentic. He had prepared escape routes to 3 different countries and maintained cash reserves in multiple currencies. But the most important contents of the vault were the detailed records Edwards kept of his former life. He had documented every aspect of the helicopter theft, not out of nostalgia or guilt, but as an insurance policy. If he was ever discovered, the information could serve as leverage against former colleagues who might have known more than they admitted during the investigation. Edwards trusted no one, not even his own memory, and his written records provided protection against both time and potential betrayal. The money itself was stored in vacuum-sealed containers that protected it from moisture and decay. Edwards had been careful not to spend the funds too quickly or conspicuously. Instead, he used small amounts to supplement his cover income from part-time work at a local hardware store. The job wasn't necessary financially, but it provided community connections and a plausible explanation for his presence in Millbrook. His co-workers found him knowledgeable about tools and construction, skills that aligned perfectly with his story about home renovation projects. Edwards had learned from studying other fugitive cases that the biggest mistake most criminals made was changing their lifestyle too dramatically after acquiring sudden wealth. He lived modestly, drove ordinary vehicles, and avoided any purchases that might attract attention from neighbors or tax authorities. The stolen money remained largely untouched, growing slowly through careful investments made under false names in different states. His greatest challenge wasn't avoiding detection by law enforcement. It was managing the psychological burden of his double life. Edwards had no friends who knew his real identity, no family relationships he could maintain, and no way to share the intellectual satisfaction he felt about having executed what he considered the perfect crime. The isolation was profound, but he accepted it as the price of freedom. The hardware store job introduced Edwards to local contractors and handymen, relationships that proved valuable for maintaining his cover. When neighbors needed small repairs or improvements, they often asked David Reynolds for recommendations. His willingness to help and his apparent expertise in construction matters made him a trusted community member. No one suspected that his knowledge came from years of modifying his own property to conceal evidence of one of Michigan's most notorious unsolved crimes. Edwards followed news coverage of his case obsessively, during the first few years after his disappearance. He read every newspaper article, watched every television report, and even obtained copies of law enforcement publications that discussed the investigation. The coverage confirmed that authorities had no viable leads and were operating under incorrect assumptions about his methods and motivations. This intelligence allowed him to adjust his behavior to avoid patterns that might eventually attract attention. As the years passed, media interest in the case diminished. The story moved from front-page news to occasional anniversary articles, and eventually to footnotes in true crime compilations. Edwards noted with satisfaction that his case was increasingly described as a cold file with little hope of resolution. The investigators who had known him personally were retiring or moving to other assignments, taking with them the institutional memory that might have recognized subtle clues about his true whereabouts. The transformation from Chris Edwards to David Reynolds was so complete that Edwards sometimes forgot details about his former life. He had to reference his hidden records to remember the names of former colleagues or the specific procedures he had once followed. The psychological compartmentalization that had made him an effective police officer now served to protect his new identity from subconscious slips that might expose his past. But Edwards made one critical miscalculation in his otherwise flawless plan. He assumed that his hidden vault would remain secret indefinitely, protected by his careful construction and the low probability that anyone would have reason to examine his garage foundation. He had not anticipated that time itself would become his enemy, that the structural modifications he had made would eventually create weaknesses that no amount of planning could prevent. The concrete floor above the hidden chamber had been carefully reinforced when Edwards first excavated the space. But concrete is a living material that expands and contracts with temperature changes, and steel beams are subject to gradual stress over decades of supporting loads they weren't originally designed to bear. The modifications Edwards had made were expertly crafted, but they were not engineered for long-term structural integrity. Small cracks began appearing in the garage floor during the winter of 2007. Hairline fractures that Edwards attributed to normal settling and seasonal temperature variations. He monitored them carefully but saw no immediate cause for concern. The cracks were minor, barely visible, and located in areas where casual visitors wouldn't notice them. Edwards applied concrete filler and considered the problem resolved. What he couldn't see was that the cracks extended deeper into the foundation than surface appearances suggested. Water from spring rains seeped into these microscopic fissures, freezing during subsequent cold snaps and expanding the damage incrementally. The process was gradual, invisible, and irreversible. Each seasonal cycle weakened the structure further, creating stress points that concentrated load in ways Edwards hadn't anticipated when he designed his hiding place. The morning of March 15, 2008, began like any other day in David Reynolds' carefully structured routine. He woke at 6:30, made coffee, and reviewed the local newspaper while eating breakfast. The weather forecast called for rain, which meant he would spend the day indoors working on small projects around the house. Edwards had always been methodical about home maintenance, viewing it as essential to maintaining his cover identity and protecting his secrets. But as he walked through the garage to retrieve tools for the day's planned activities, Edwards heard a sound that made his blood freeze. It was a subtle groaning noise, the kind of structural complaint that experienced investigators learn to recognize as a warning of imminent failure. The concrete floor beneath his feet felt different, less solid, as if the foundation itself was shifting. Edwards immediately recognized the danger. 23 years of concealment were about to be undone by the simple physics of concrete, steel, and time. The hidden chamber that had protected his secrets and his freedom was becoming his greatest vulnerability, and there was nothing he could do to stop what happened next. The collapse came with a sound like thunder rolling through the earth. Edwards felt the floor buckle beneath his feet as decades of hidden stress finally overwhelmed the modified foundation. Steel beams twisted with metallic shrieks, concrete cracked in jagged lines that spread like lightning, and the carefully constructed, false floor that had concealed his vault for over 2 decades gave way in a cascade of debris and dust. Edwards threw himself backward as sections of the garage floor collapsed inward, revealing the hidden chamber he had spent 23 years protecting. The vacuum-sealed containers tumbled from their concealed shelves, spilling their contents across the wreckage. Bundles of cash, yellowed with age but still crisp, scattered like confetti in the morning light. The forged documents he had crafted so carefully were pinned beneath chunks of concrete, and the detailed records of his former life lay exposed for anyone to see. The noise was tremendous, echoing through the quiet neighborhood like a construction accident or demolition gone wrong. Edwards knew that curious neighbors would arrive within minutes, drawn by the sound and the dust cloud that was already rising from his property. Mrs. Patterson would be among the first, concerned about her tenant and her investment. Local emergency responders would follow, and with them would come questions that David Reynolds could never answer without destroying the identity that Chris Edwards had spent decades perfecting. Edwards stood frozen in the doorway, watching 23 years of careful planning crumble into ruins. The stolen money lay scattered across broken concrete, visible to anyone who looked into the garage. The identification documents that had taken months to acquire were torn and dirty, but still readable. Worst of all, the handwritten records he had maintained as insurance against discovery now served as a complete confession, documenting every detail of the helicopter theft that had made him one of Michigan's most wanted fugitives. The irony was devastating. Edwards had anticipated every possible threat to his security except the one that ultimately destroyed him. He had prepared for police investigations, nosy neighbors, financial audits, and background checks. He had created multiple escape routes and backup identities, but he had never considered that the very structure he had modified to hide his secrets would eventually betray him through simple material fatigue and the inexorable passage of time. Footsteps approached from the street as neighbors emerged from their houses to investigate the disturbance. Edwards could hear Mrs. Patterson calling his name, asking if he was hurt, expressing concern about the damage to her property. Behind her voice came others, the curious residents of Maple Street gathering to witness what appeared to be a structural accident, but was actually the exposure of one of the most audacious crimes in law enforcement history. Edwards had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he spent the rest of his life in prison or found some way to escape once again. The David Reynolds identity was finished, compromised beyond any hope of repair. The money was exposed, the documents were visible, and the records would provide investigators with enough evidence to reconstruct not only the original crime, but every detail of his decades-long deception. But Chris Edwards had not survived 23 years as a fugitive by panicking in crisis situations. The same methodical intelligence that had planned the helicopter theft now focused on the immediate problem of survival. He stepped back from the ruined garage, closed the door as casually as possible, and walked toward the approaching neighbors with the confused expression of a man who had just experienced an unexpected accident. "Something collapsed in there," he told Mrs. Patterson, gesturing toward the garage with apparent bewilderment. "Sounded like the whole foundation gave way. I think we need to call someone to make sure it's structurally safe before anyone goes inside." The lie bought him precious time, creating a reason to keep people away from the evidence while he considered his options. Mrs. Patterson immediately began making phone calls to contractors and building inspectors, exactly as Edwards had hoped. The other neighbors offered assistance and shared stories of similar structural problems in older buildings. Their genuine concern and willingness to help provided perfect cover for Edwards to appear shocked and grateful rather than guilty and desperate. Within hours, Edwards had vanished once again, But this time there was no helicopter, no carefully planned escape route, and no months of preparation. The exposed vault told investigators everything they needed to know. The $2.8 million recovered from the wreckage, the forged documents, and Edwards' meticulous records provided closure to a case that had haunted Detroit for over 2 decades. Edwards was captured 3 days later at a bus station in Ohio, carrying a single bag and the last remnants of his stolen fortune. The perfect crime had finally met its imperfect ending, undone not by brilliant detective work, but by the simple reality that even the best laid plans cannot account for time itself.